Thank you for joining us for the Autism Parenting Summit. My name is Sharon Longo, and I'll be your host for this session titled AuDHD, the Overlap We Keep Missing. We're thrilled to have Marcia Eckert with us today. Marcia has provided therapy, evaluation, and consultation for autistic individuals across the U.S. since 1985. She serves on the Connecticut ASD Advisory Council and the Board of Directors of Autism Today. She's a frequent presenter on webinars and podcasts, and she has presented at U.S. national and international conferences. She's a prolific writer with journal articles on diagnosing autistic adults and autistic women, and she advocates for an updated understanding of neurodiversity, focusing on improving recognition of autism in girls, understanding AuDHD, and centering the lived experiences of neurodivergent individuals. Please join me in welcoming Marcia Eckert. Welcome, Marcia.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sharon, for having me. And I really appreciate this opportunity to present for Autism Parenting Magazine. You do so much for families and give them so much good information. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this conference. What we're going to be talking today about is AU-ADHD and how do we understand it? How do we support it? How do we support our kids who have both autism and ADHD? And it's pretty obvious. It's called AU-ADHD, AuDHD. It's not something that was even recognized until 2013. You weren't allowed to diagnose both. But so it's not widely understood. It's not widely expected. But what we need to understand is living as somebody who has both autism and ADHD is its own lived experience. It's more than labels. It's more than just one thing or another. And that's what we want to understand. That's what we want to advocate for. The most important thing to start out with is how common it is. I've read a lot of research. It goes between 40 and 70% of kids who are autistic also have ADHD. So we're talking about most kids here. We're not just talking about a few. And so one of the things I want the audience to start thinking about is, could my child also have ADHD? What of what I'm seeing could be ADHD? And as many as 25% of kids who are thought just to have ADHD also have autism. So there's a lot of overlap that nobody's really understood before. The core diagnostic symptoms for ADHD and autism are different. We're all aware of that. But the children can look very alike. They can have some of the same challenges in terms of having relationships, in terms of attention, in terms of what looks like impulsivity, and certainly in terms of executive functions. And it matters because it's, like I said, it's a specific lived experience. And we need to understand the challenges. I'm going to go into this more, but what we need to understand is our understanding from just thinking of our kids as autistic has to shift a bit to understanding the whole experience that the child is having and maybe explaining some of the things that just didn't make sense. So briefly, you all know this. Autism is social communication, the cognitive style, behaviors, interest, sensory hypersensitivities, and predictability. That's the diagnosis criteria. And ADHD has to do with attention regulation, impulsivity. And people often say that ADHD is a disorder of executive function. So the diagnostic criteria are different, but actually both have a lot of overlapping features, so it's hard to tell. And one of the big questions is AU-ADHD a thing of its own? Is it autism plus ADHD, or is it its own thing? And the answer is the research is inconclusive in my mind. It's a relatively new thing that could be diagnosed only since 2013, and the research in my mind is flawed because they're not always comparing comparable groups. So in one study I saw, they were comparing more impaired younger kids to children who were doing better, who had both. And how do you compare the two? They use different measures to look at one group, to look at another group. A measure might be better at looking at autism than ADHD or vice versa. So we're still in the beginning of really good research. And how do they compare? Again, beginning of really good research, but there are quite a few studies that say it's additive. Having the two challenges is more than just having the one. But again, if we think about it, autism is quite a spectrum from kids who are profoundly impaired to kids who are able to do quite a few things to achieve in school, but still need support. And so, which kid are we comparing? Are we comparing a child with AU-ADHD who's at one end of the spectrum or the other, or the same thing for the autistic child, or the same thing for the ADHD child? So it's not as simple as these kids look one way and we're simply comparing one group with another. It's what is this child? Where is this child on the spectrum? How do we understand it? And the one thing I want to be clear about is I have a neurodiversity affirming lens, which is to say neurodiversity is are acceptable. We don't expect every tree to be an oak tree. We know there are kids who are white, there are kids who are black, there are kids who are tall, there are kids who are short, there are kids who are dynamic, verbally expressive, and there are kids who really have trouble. And so, neurodiversity in how we think and how we process, however, somehow the idea is that it's only a disorder, when in fact, there are strengths and challenges. And many researchers, including Simon Baron Cohen, who is knighted for his autism research, now calls it autism spectrum condition and talks about the strengths and the accomplishments of so many people who are autistic. So much of the problem comes that the world is not designed with these kids in mind. And so much of the emphasis is getting these kids to look like something other than who they are. And that's where, so as one girl that I worked with said, my problem isn't my autism, the problem is everybody else. And so when you have both autism and ADHD, then the risk of a mismatch and not understanding is even greater because there's more going on. So we're going to cover quite a bit today, and we're going to do our best to whiz through it so we have some questions. The traits can mask each other for the kids who are quiet and girls who mask. It can be very hard to see. And all of these kids try very, very hard to fit in. And so one of the cues is that they are exhausted, they are wiped. And by the end of the day, they just may be fried. And that has significance both at home and at school, because if you think about it, if you're working so hard to kind of fit in, to control the different ways in which you're different, at 10 o'clock, you might be doing well. By 2 o'clock, you may be just like your coping skills may be pretty much done with. And so they say, well, why does he do so well in history and so poorly in English? Well, maybe it's because English is at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And when these kids get home, many of them will just either totally need to rest or go to a space or do something that's a comfort and that's a relaxation. And one of the questions that often comes up is, well, then you become the homework police. You've got to get this kid to do the homework. And maybe the kid is just so fried and there's so much frustration going in both directions. So that's something we really have to think about and advocate for when we're advocating for our kids. So think about it. Okay, you have things going in opposite directions. You have the autistic kid who needs predictability, needs sameness, wants to know what's going to happen. And then you have ADHD trait that's going to pull you toward novelty, pull you in the other direction. And that what that's going to do is have you kind of going into ways where you want this, but you also want that at the same time. And so the part of you really wants things planned out, wants everything predictable, and another part of you says, I want something different. And so there can be very deep shame. I had one kid who really was a perfectionist, wanted to plan, had every idea of what they were supposed to be doing, both at home and school, and couldn't pull it off. And, they were supposed to be straightening up their room, for example, and instead they were just sitting there. And the kid had a lot of shame because he felt, I'm just a couch potato. I'm terrible. I can't do what's expected of me. And sometimes these kids get the feedback, well, you're not motivated. And it's not motivated, it's that they have these different pulls going in different directions. So I want to talk about different kinds of attention because attention is a factor for both ADHD kids and autistic kids, and certainly for AUADHD kids. There's the ability to sort of sustain focus over time. We know that can be hard for everybody except for our autistic kids who are monotropic and go deep, deep into an interest. Selective attention is being able to just focus on one thing when there's others going on. That's hard for both. Our autistic kids may be really having a difficult time because there's multiple sensory things coming in. There's other noises, there's lights, there's people moving, and that can be very difficult, and you can get sensory overwhelm. For the autistic kids, they're distracted, their mind goes off in the direction of whatever is going on around them. So everybody can have trouble with selective attention. But divided attention is the ability to manage multiple tasks. Now we know that's hard for our autistic kids, right? We know it's hard for them to have divided attention, but the ADHD part might, divide, but then go off in the wrong direction. And so we have to understand that when we give a child more than one thing to do at once, that takes not only attention, it takes working memory, being able to have hold on to what you're being asked to do. So it can be hard. Switching, well, we know, right? Our autistic kids have trouble switching. And again, the ADHD kids can switch much more easily. As a matter of fact, they're known for they start doing this and then they start doing that and then they do this and that first thing is way over there. Where they're known, but they're not necessarily switching the way we want them to. We want you to go from writing to taking notes to listening, and that might be difficult. They may be listening and then their minds go off on something and they're thinking of something else. So we have to understand that switching can be hard for everyone, although it's a classic thing for the autistic kids. And executive attention has to do with being able to regulate all of this and pull in all the skills you need so that if people are looking when I'm not going to talk a lot about testing, but I want to say one thing about testing. As somebody who did testing for 25 years, so certainly I do understand the importance of neuropsych testing. But you've got to understand that when you are working with one of these children and you're doing testing, it's one-on-one in a quiet room with measures that are not really replicating what happens out there in real time. So a child who can look at, say, a picture of people interacting and tell you what's going on or tell you something about it, that doesn't mean they can do it in real time. And it's easier to inhibit, it's easier to do sustained effort when you've got someone there asking you questions, keeping you focused. So there's a questionnaire called the brief behavior. It's a behavior inventory of executive functions, and it really looks at how is the child doing on this in real time. And I think that's such an important measure. Sometimes somebody can look good on testing, but in the real world, they're really struggling. And challenges are, as I said before, working memory. Kids with ADHD are known for having trouble with working memory. You tell them three things and they remember the last one, or they were focused on the first one and the other two went. And being able to plan requires working memory. Being able to sustain effort requires working memory. And the monotropism of our autistic kids, their intense focus on a single thing, can make it difficult to do the shifting and the kind of things that we want them to do for executive functions. So again, we need to know what's most characteristic of our child. Is it the monotropism and they get stuck and you can't get them off of it? Or is it, the working memory? Is it the fact that autistic ADHD kids can hyperfocus too if they're interested? So we really have to understand our specific kid. And stress makes anything harder. I can't emphasize that enough. When a child is stressed by pressure, by environmental overwhelm, by the fact that they're tired or they're not feeling well, that makes a performance significantly harder to pull off. And so we have to understand, as I said at the beginning, they may look different different days, but when they're stressed, they're going to have more trouble doing what we want them to do and what they want to do. So attention, again, I've pretty much covered this, but in ADHD, we think of it more as being driven outward, going out, and autism, we think of it more as going inward to interests. And then we have this child who's pulled between inward and outward. So I made this slide for you so you could have access to it. I'm sure that a handout could be available to you, or this slide could be made available to you if you really want to understand different kinds of attention, what it looks like in ADHD, in autism, and then when somebody is having both. We can have kind of have this in the back of our minds when we're trying to understand our specific children and what might be going on. Now, a child is not necessarily going to be able to explain to us, oh, it's because I'm distractible and I have bursts of attention, or it's because I'm having multiple inputs. The child's not necessarily going to be able to say that. So we have to have ideas in the back of our head and then ask questions to help process what is it that's happening. So, supporting, the first thing we have to do is understand. Just because they're not sustaining their focus doesn't mean that they are unmotivated. Just because they can seem cognitively rigid, because they have trouble shifting, doesn't mean that they're oppositional. And they get interpreted that way so often at school. And sometimes at home, you're focused on this. I need you to do that now. And you're just being difficult. We have to do this. It's time to go. So we really have to understand that this is part of wiring that we're dealing with. And so when we supporting the kids, we want to match supports to the needs of the child and what's going on with the child. So if we're supporting the child using their strengths, using their interests, is incredibly important. And for the kid with ADHD, we want to sort of optimize the conditions where they're going to be able to function. And we all know that. We make sure that they're not in a just highly distractible environment. We give them cues. And the same thing can be true for our kids on the spectrum, that they don't do well in an environment that's sensory overload. So I've talked about expecting variability, and we need to support executive functions in a way that works for that child. Having a kid who's totally disorganized and has difficulty seeing the big picture and breaking it down into pieces, which is so often the case for children on the spectrum. They don't get the big picture and what is the priority, or because they're ADHD, it's hard sort of with the working memory to have all the attention. We can't just hand them an organizer or a graphic organizer or something like that and say, okay, fill this in. Because if they knew what went in there, they'd be organized in the first place. So sometimes we have to help them kind of brainstorm, well, what are all the pieces to this? And then how we break it down. We talk about chunking work. Well, we have to chunk a lot of different kinds of tasks to help them know how to do it. And we have to pay attention both to having routines, to having predictability, which is necessary for autistic kids, but also for building in the possibility of flexibility. And I think with all kids, autistic and ADHD, having autonomy, having some sense of control over what you're doing is so important. It serves all of these issues that we're talking about. So, as I said, internal conflicts, time. Isn't time a problem? Isn't saying, okay, we have to be out the door by 4:15 to get to whatever this is, and either ADHD, they're on ADHD time zone, or autism, they're monotropic, they're into something. We all have different strategies we use. We use a timer that shows them the time. We have different strategies. Maybe we have them try to transition ahead of time so that by the time the time comes, they're ready. But that's a conflict, especially when the child wants to be able to do the right thing. But the ADHD component is often these kids don't have a sense of time and they're being distracted by everything on the way. So we need to understand that. Planning, again, The forgetting against the perfectionism can be very, very frustrating. And take food. Okay, if you have a kid who wants everything the same, I only eat Velveeta cheese, period. Okay. And another child who wants texture and taste to be different, be interesting. And then you make that the same child. It's going to be a challenge, isn't it? So we have to really pay attention to what they do and what does this particular child need. So you've got these competing needs. And what does that mean for the experience of the child? It means you're going to have a lot of frustration. It means you're going to have a child who gets tired because they're working so hard to just do what they need to do. And as I said before, there's a Yerkes-Dodson law that's a very neat little graph that anyone ever wants to see it, I can show you, of what stress does to performance. And it goes like this. It's very, very hard for any of us to perform when we're really stressed. Have you ever been, you're trying to work in the kitchen and do something, and you know the guests are coming, and someone asks you a question and you snap? Whereas if you're chill and you're just doing it, all afternoon, it's easy to do. So we're all that way. We all have trouble when we're stressed. What helps? Well, as I said, a combination of structure and flexibility, having a predictable structure, but also that autonomy, that choice, and the opportunity for novelty, so that if the child wants it, it's there. And we want to, again, go to understanding the specific needs of this child in this context at this time. So I know that's complicated, but where is our child on this spectrum? How much of different elements are involved? In what contexts? Because it might be different in different contexts. I have one guy that I see who is really good, and if he's doing math, that's all he thinks about. If you're trying to talk to him, he's also thinking about math. So a support for him can be quite different than a support for a child who can, sustain that attention. And whenever possible, we want to build on their strengths. We want to build on their capacity for problem solving. These are the kids, the out of the box thinkers, the kids who are going to come up with ideas that nobody else does because everyone else is focused like this at a certain level. Our kids with autistic tendencies are going deep. Our kids with ADHD are going wide. This kid may be going wide and deep. So they're going to come up with things that others don't necessarily think of. And so they can be very dynamic thinkers. And so they have strengths. We want to try to use that capacity in appreciating them and giving them a role in what they're doing. I think it's important with social supports to I'm a very strong believer that the rewards and the impulse has to be intrinsic. So, like with my young man who's so into math, he really has a lot of trouble when he feels rejected. But it's very hard for him to understand the social expectations of being, of not being rejected. So, talking with him, it doesn't make sense to him that people want eye contact. That maybe he, if he wants the people to feel he's listening, maybe he has to explain it. I listen better when I'm not looking, or he has to helping them not just saying, okay, eyes on me, which can be so hard for a lot of these kids, but rather, do I explain myself? How do I do this in a way that's authentic for me? That's not just masking, because we all know that masking can be so effortful and ultimately can lead to depression because who you are authentically is not what's you're allowed to have come across. So the strengths, I was referring to that before, that innovation, that capacity for deep focus that many other kids don't have. These kids can be more adaptable in terms of they're seeing things, they can go places other people can't go. And there can be a lot of passion, whether it's for that monotropic focus or whether it's the ADHD drive to, do what they're doing. And so we need to know that these kids are going to have a level of passion about what they're interested in that we can really harness and we can not as a reward for doing something else, but use that in itself as a way for the child to be doing what they're doing. And they all have a lot of sensory awareness, so they're much more tuned into their environment. They may not be tuned into social context, but they're tuned in to their environment and what their environment is like for them. So I've been referring to social relationships. We know that social relationships are hard for our kids on the spectrum, and that's often something we're spending so much energy just trying to help with. They're going to miss the social cues. The ADHD part can have that you're missing things because of inattention, but you would pick it up. The spectrum part is you just don't get what it's about in the first place. You don't understand the social rules, and you may have a child who's struggling with both. And how do we help them? You know, it may be they need breaks. We have to have realistic expectations. Marching them into a family gathering and expecting them to, pay attention and be appropriate with everyone is very, very difficult. One young guy that I had who is on the spectrum, who he would not go with his family and ever say it's nice to see you if it wasn't. Okay. We're not going to get him to do it because to him that was lying. So often these kids are masking and they are trying to do what they see other people do. Many kids that I see memorize things. They memorize phrases people use. They memorize body language. They memorize even phrases sometimes. And other kids may think that's a little bit weird, but they're doing their darndest to fit in. And many ADHD kids do that as well. And we have to understand how exhausting that is. We have to help our children navigate things as authentically as possible. So there's a myth, I'm sure all of you know this if you have kids. Most kids on the spectrum, not 100%, but most want friends. They want to connect. So do and they're so sensitive if they're not part of a group. There, so many things get in the way of the executive functions and the ability to kind of be present in a conversation in a way that works. Now but the idea that they're not caring is wrong. And they may seem social. It may seem like someone is fitting in, but internally they're not fitting in at all. And they're really feeling, I don't belong here. Or I had one girl who had ADHD and autism, and she would look very social. She would be engaged with a lot of people, but she had no lasting friends, no one who really stuck with her. And so, again, what happens when you don't have friends or you don't feel that you've got a connection with people? There's that loneliness. There can be a lot of anticipatory anxiety about social situations. And in a sense, so many of the adults that I see have this internalized sense of shame. I didn't try hard enough. People kept telling me if I just tried harder, if I just didn't do this, if I just did that, I would have friends. And it really is a message of don't be who you are. And who I am is not likable. And that is something we really, really do not want. We want our kids to know that who they are is worthwhile and that they're all usually really caring, good, loyal kids who struggle to communicate that and to be known. And so not having that known is traumatic. There's been research very recently at Yale about PTSD, and what they've discovered is you can have PTSD not just from having a very fearful incident, not being in war and having something dreadful happen, but also from emotional pain. And if you think of how many of our kids experience emotional pain from rejection, from being misunderstood, and that emotional pain can actually cause PTSD. So that we're dealing with a child who is incredibly reactive, incredibly self-protective because of that traumatic stress. And the thing we also need to understand is all of this can be invisible, especially for a child who's high masking. It's not obvious what's going on. And so when they don't do it right, we blame them. Or we may not blame them, but others may blame them that you're too intense or you're annoying. These kids here are annoying a lot, and or you're interrupting the conversation. It's under helping understand that these kids internally are experiencing this, so they externally may not look autistic. Okay, and that has nothing to do necessarily with what's going on inside. Rejection sensitive dysphoria is something you hear about a lot in the autistic community. Very, very big feelings after a perceived rejection, and it may not even be a rejection. It may be the perception of a rejection. It may be that they are so used to being rejected that two kids over there not paying attention or not they're it's a personal thing, or that might be that they're talking and the assumption is they're talking about me. They're not liking me. And so you get that anticipatory anxiety, and you get kids who go down a rabbit hole. So there's a perceived rejection, or there's a perceived, you know, criticism. And they go down the rabbit hole of no one likes me, everyone hates me, I've always been bad, I don't fit in everywhere, all the times that's happened. And we need to understand that it's not just that they're choosing to stew in their own juices, that this is something that happens when you have this kind of a dysphoria. And we have to help them remember, at first, we have to help them calm down, remember out stress. We have to help them calm down, but then we have to help them process. Well, remember and so and so invited you over? Does that seem like she liked you? Yeah, yeah. Why would she choose to spend? We have to help them kind of get themselves out of that hole, not tell them you shouldn't be in it. Has anyone ever felt better because they were told they should feel better? I don't think that happens for any of us. And so support that actually helps. We need to help them expect what's going to go on. I had one girl and she was on a field trip with four other girls, and she felt left out. The four of them bonded, they were talking, they were sitting together, and she was on the side. Now, she was so much wanted to be part of the group, but when we talked about it, she really didn't like any of them. She really wasn't interested in what they were talking about. She really thought they were kind of stupid, but she didn't want to be left out of the group. And so we need to help them understand that having one or two really good friends who get you can be more important and better than being part of a group, which maybe actually isn't that great. And because there's a tendency to idealize being part of a group, particularly when you're a young teenager, or preteen, or a teenager. There's all these groups. You want to be part of a group, and you're not part of one. We may need to help them identify potential relationships. Be a friend, okay? Or in school, you will 4 out of 5 times go to sit at a table with other people. Well, we need to help them understand which table are they going to sit at. Where is a child who might be someone who's accepting as opposed to maybe someone who's been teasing them? Or maybe that at that moment the child just needs a break. Maybe they need some space to calm down. So it really, we need their help. They need our help to think through who's a good person, when is a good time, when do I need some space, and to have all that be okay. So often in schools, there are lunch bunches where you can go to the social worker's office, but many kids will feel, why do I have to need a social worker, have something be wrong with me just to have a quiet place to eat lunch? Wouldn't it be nice if everybody had access to a quiet place to eat lunch, not just kids who are defined as on the spectrum or having problems, but anybody might choose to have a quiet lunch. Small groups are so much better than big groups. And sometimes, like with this, several of the kids I'm working with, talking about what do you want to happen? Well, I want to be part of a conversation. Well, they don't realize it, but they're breaking in. And so talk about strategies. One strategy might be asking, is it okay if I join you? How can you do this in a way that works for you? And, we want to coach them before. Who are we going to be with? What do we know about them? What can we expect from them? What is the context? Because it's different. If joining a basketball team is very different than joining the yearbook club. All right, in terms of, I had a kid who was he was joining the basketball team. I said, just watch. And it turned out people high-fived, people how people express support each other was very different than, say, in a classroom. So we don't want a kind of rote idea of this is how you express things. We want to look at what the context is. What are people doing? How can I understand that? Not that I have to do it, but how do I understand it? What do I choose to do? What works for me? And then debrief after. What happened? How did it feel? What led you to feel accepted? What went right? So often I'm saying to kids, let's understand what went right so we can try to consciously do that. And in the moment, what we don't want to do is saying, okay, John, I want you to, okay, that's so embarrassing. Nobody wants to be singled out. You can have little signals, kind of like you do with your spouse when you might say, look, I'm going to want to leave early. So when I do this, I mean, I want to leave early. We can do that with the kids too. Look, if you need a break, just, do that. And I know you need to get out, but it's not, in the moment saying, John, do you need to leave? You're looking. No, we don't want to do that to them. That's humiliating. Accommodations at home and school, sensory tools. OTs are gifts from God. OTs can be geniuses. I had one kid whose ability to calm down was putting his hand in a bucket of sand. Now, I would never have thought of that in a million years. I have one guy who does use clay or fidgets. I have other people who do wall push-ups. What works is what works for that particular child in terms of sensory tools for self-calming. Many have weighted, vests. It's what works for this particular child. And sometimes we have to change the environment. If the lighting is too bright or it's too noisy in a classroom or there's too many distractions, we know we have to change that. But also, I have to tell you, there are times when a child's need for a break is seen as manipulating the system. You just want to get out of Spanish. Okay. Or if I give you a break, you're going to take advantage of it, or everybody's going to want a break. No, if this child needs a break, this child needs a break. We do what each child needs and genuinely needs. Pacing, I talked about homework. That's something we may have to think about. Or pacing the afternoon. They may need a different slight pace than they did in the morning. So look at not just what is the work, but what is the pace. And a child may need help, for example, with writing, but be really, really good at literature and reading and discussing. And we don't want to hold them back to the level of their writing. But if they're going to be getting help writing and slower at writing, then how fast do they have to produce papers? Okay, so we want to think about pace. We've talked about self-regulation and having those sensory tools or breaks or whatever works for them. It might, some kids really go with meditation and breathing and mindfulness, and some aren't that willing. What works for our child? And above all, a non-judgmental stance, an accepting stance. So often kids experience adults coming at them with an agenda. Well, if I come at you with an agenda, I'm not accepting you. And so we need to remember sometimes we need to let go of our agendas. Medication is one possibility. Certainly, medication is often used with ADHD. It can reduce the impulsivity, it can reduce the inattention. It doesn't work all the time. And some kids are very, very sensitive to side effects. So we have to work with a doctor in terms of, but the other thing I suggest is whatever the medication we're considering, that we have to give it a trial. We have to give it enough time to work, particularly with things for depression and anxiety, because it takes a while to work. So we want to see if something works and give it an adequate trial. And sometimes rather than just saying, okay, medication doesn't work for ADHD, there are a lot of different things. There are things that are non-stimulants. So working with a doctor is really important. We need to realize, unfortunately, I've said these kids have autism and ADHD. They may also have a depressive disorder. They may also have an anxiety disorder, especially if that runs in the family. Being depressed because somebody just rejected you is not going to be fixed by a pill. Or being anxious because you know that in that classroom it's going to be really noisy and the teacher is going to expect you to participate and you don't quite know how to do it, or if you say something your experiences people laugh. No pill is going to fix that anxiety. But there are kids who have anxiety disorders, who have a constant state of anxiety, or who have depressive disorders. Those kids may have their doctors want to consider medication. There should be a broad plan. You know, they talk about it takes a community. Well, it does. It takes support at home. It takes support from a therapeutic team. Sometimes it takes support at school. Maybe there's neighbors or relatives who can be supportive. We want the child to feel that they're surrounded, that people have their back. And that's really, so we want a broad plan, not just a pill. So, what do I want you to take away from this? Number one, what we're talking about, AuADHD, is really, really common. If you have a kid on the spectrum, more often than not, they will have an ADHD component to who they are and how they're experiencing the world and how they're performing. So we need to keep that in mind. They need us to understand why. That can take a lot of exploration and understanding and having a theoretical ideas, questions in our mind about what might be going on. And we want our children's point of view. If the child says, this is too much, but the teacher says it's not, or we look at it and it doesn't look like too much, we have to understand, why does it feel like too much? Because we have to have the child feel my feelings, my thoughts are taken seriously. Okay. And compassion, understanding that what we want to do is have practical supports, realistic expectations, and that attitude of understanding that every kid is worthwhile. Every kid is worth, and the fact that they're struggling doesn't change that at all because they're going to, that idea of emotional PTSD is very real. And we really have to help our kids not fall victim to that. So thank you. In case any of you want to get a hold of me, this is how you can do it. My email and my websites. And so I welcome you to visit, or I welcome your questions. And I also welcome Sharon, who may have some questions.
I do. I actually have a few questions. That was wonderful, by the way. But first question. Now you mentioned that stress makes it much harder for AuDHD kids to use their executive skills. So, what are a few simple things that parents can do in the moment to lower stress and help their child reset?
That's a really great question, because I think what we really need to understand is that the child can be overwhelmed past their coping ability. So saying calm down, saying it's not that big a deal is just not going to help. What we first need to do is be a container, be a calming presence, and just be there, be understanding. This is really hard. Not this isn't really hard, or this isn't a big, this is really hard. I get it. And then if the child has strategies that help them calm down, whether it's doing math problems or listening to music or breathing, we want to encourage them. And one of the things that I encourage parents to do is whatever the strategy is, especially these mindfulness strategies, do it yourself. Don't have this is just something you do if you're disordered or broken or there's something wrong with you. You know, I find that meditation is a life tool. I find breathing is a life tool. You know what? This is stressful. I'm going to take 3 deep breaths. So it's not just something we're telling them to do. It's a normal part of life to use these ways of calming down. And so we want to be present to facilitate that, or if nothing else, simply give them a safe space so that they can use a strategy and calm down. You can't hurry calming down. What you can do is be there to facilitate it.
Mhm. Right, right. Um, so then you had explained that focus and attention can be misunderstood in AuDHD kids. And at home, long focus can look like stubbornness, and distractibility can look like they're not trying. So how can parents better understand what's really going on for an AuDHD child in those moments?
I think that the phrase that comes to mind is innocent until proven guilty. Let's assume they're doing the best they can. Let's assume that whatever we're seeing is their genuine effort to do whatever we're asking them to do, and that they are trying, and what gets in their ways, what gets in their way, as opposed to jumping to the conclusion that, this isn't, you're not motivated. And as I said, it may be that they simply are out of coping skills.
Mhm.
It may be something like that. So we want to have in the back of our minds what could be possible, but start out with taking them seriously. Ross Green has a wonderful model. It's called Lives in the Balance, where the first thing we do is validate. Say, I understand this is how you're feeling, or I understand this is hard for you. And then we might bring in something else, okay, as opposed to invalidating them.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, we all want to be validated and be heard and seen. So,
Yeah.
so many AuDHD children want friends, as you had mentioned, but they feel exhausted or overwhelmed by social situations. So, how can parents support their child after school or social time, especially when they seem irritable, they shut down, or they're done for the day?
Well, I mean, so often, if an adult comes home from work and they're done for the day, they have a glass of wine and they sit down and they are like, this is not the moment I want to be social. And the
Mhm.
same thing is true for our kids. If they are done for the day, if they have used all their coping skills, then, oh, let's go play or let's do this. It's just not a great idea because it might just be too stressful. Okay. It's really important to facilitate relationships. I always tell kids, you've got to find your people.
Mhm.
And sometimes there's a push that kids have to be friends with people who are really not interested in being friends with them. And that's not fair because that's a setup for failure. So, what we want to find is a child who shares their interest or the child who might be neurodivergent himself or her, themselves, who is more accepting of someone and is also going to take a deep dive or be kind of a little on the hyper side themselves so that they don't see it as so annoying. They understand. So we want to try to find who is a child that would be a good match. And
Mhm.
then we might, my friend Rob, colleague, we're writing a book together on autistic kids. They th- he would do something where he'd sit down with a little girl and another little girl, and they would do reading together, okay? Or they would do a project together, or they would, encourage them to do something where you're not simply sitting there having to interact. Isn't that hard? I mean, that's sort of like a dating site. What we want to do is have something that everybody's going to like to do. And then, while we tend to see parallel play, kind of encourage talking about it in a way that's facilitative, not directing.
Um, yeah. So then looking ahead, what do you see as the most pressing areas for future research or advocacy regarding AuDHD?
I'm going to say this for ADHD, for ADHD, for ADHD, and for autism. There has to be an understanding of the impact of interventions on the mental health of our children because it's not understood how often they experience something that's well intentioned as invalidating. I'm not saying that people don't have good intentions, but if it doesn't accept or it doesn't recognize the authenticity of the child, the effort of the child, then the child can have that kind of anxiety, depression, shame. And when I look at many of the goals for these kids, the goal is conformity. And the idea is these kids are the way they are, and it doesn't do anything bad to them to tell them to be different. Actually, you're doing something good to them if you tell them to be different. But I have a really interesting number. the high school kids are supposed to take part in um, their own secondary, post-secondary planning. And when it came to children who had learning disabilities, dysgraphia, dyslexia, only 25% of them didn't participate. For children who had intellectual challenges, IQs below 70, 50% of them participated. 77% of the autistic kids didn't participate. Why? Because they've been told all along that your ideas don't matter. And they're depressed because they just feel I'm not worthwhile. You tell me what to do. And so the first research I want to see is how do interventions affect the mental health of our children? Then we have to understand so much more about AuADHD and how it impacts kids. And again, remembering that it's very hard to compare. Are we comparing like groups of kids? But we need to understand more about them. I'm always into how do they present clinically, what's their life like? But people also want to do research on, what are the factors that come out on the research. That's important too. And, I think that it's important. It's to people looking at the similarity in terms of is there one distinct thing that's AuADHD, especially if that tends to give us ideas for the best interventions. But so much has to do with the particular child. To say that 95% of the time, if you're AUADHD, this works, doesn't mean that you're not in the 5%. So we want more understanding. We want to know more about them. Notice I put ideology last. I don't mean that it's unimportant, but how to help them and what impact we're having on them has so much to do with the quality of their lives that I really do want to see research on that. And, so it comes down to people being able to have a better understanding and be more compassionate. That's part of what my book is about, hopefully.
Right, right. Well, I want to thank you so much, Marcia, because this session was really valuable. A lot of great information, really great explanations to help parents understand better. And that's what we all need. So thank you so much. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today as well. Be sure to check out the Autism Parenting Summit agenda. We have many more presentations and interviews scheduled with people who are on the spectrum and experts in the field. So thank you.
And thank you so much for having me, and to all of those in the audience who hung in. Thank you. Bye bye.